Hi, Kathleen Guire here. Welcome to Trauma Informed Parenting. Let's talk about the trauma bucket. Everybody has a trauma bucket. Think of a metaphorical bucket. Like I said, everyone has one when they are born. Some of us have nice, shiny, clean buckets with no trauma inside when we're born. But some of us have trauma in our buckets. And I'm thinking of kiddos specifically because that's what this is about, parenting these kiddos with trauma histories. Some kiddos have prenatal trauma, exposure to drugs, alcohol, lots of stress on the mother, which raises the cortisol level when she's pregnant and it crosses the placenta. So that means a child is born with trauma in their bucket. So they may not be able to handle stress as well as other kiddos. Then after the child is born, he may have the trauma of living with a capital letter syndrome, meaning they view the life through a different lens and it seems like they got the wrong rule book or roadmap and everybody's living differently, and it's difficult to try to figure out what social cues are or knowing that there are social cues. But then also for the parents, there's a season of trying to find a diagnosis and figure out how to navigate the therapies, the test, etc., and how to find the tools that work. But meanwhile, like I said, the child is viewing life through the lens of that capital letter syndrome. Here's another way of looking at it. It's like being in a foreign country and not speaking the language. So this child is living with his life with a trauma bucket that's already a third of the way full or more, depending on the severity and the length of their trauma, or living with an undiagnosed capital letter syndrome. With this in mind, once you know your child's capital letter syndrome or have an idea of what sorts of trauma you are dealing with, you can begin to use new parenting tools, learn and teach new habits, coping mechanisms, and put systems into place. You can work best on co-regulating habits in a felt safe environment. You can change. This is at home, like if you're cocooning at home and you're trying to figure all of these things out, you can change many high-level behaviors to low-level behaviors and decrease the severity and frequency in a felt safe environment, i.e. home. And just a warning, this is going to require you to stay home more until you have that foundation of connection, a schedule, the proper parenting tools for that specific child, and coping mechanisms in place. This is the time to build on the practices that are working and delete the ones that are not. Now, I'm just going to say at every level of the trauma bucket, there are triggers. We all have triggers. So because you're staying home and working on these things and maybe learning some new things that do work, that doesn't mean there won't be regressions or triggers. But in that felt safe environment, you're going to reduce the severity and frequency of those triggers. And then you'll have more peace in your home. So the second level of the trauma bucket is negative stress, excitatory stress, sensory sensitivities. So more triggers. And why I say that is because this is when you leave the felt safe environment of your home for activities, church, sports, birthday parties, therapy, school, etc. Then triggers are tripped more frequently. And the sensory overload is more frequent. So you might feel like, okay, we're doing great at home. We're going to go to this birthday party. And then you step out the door and you might feel as if all the hard work that you did at home is null and void. It's not. I'm going to give you an example. You need to just kind of put yourself in this scenario. Imagine yourself listening to instructions from a boss or a professor and taking furious notes, like you're rocking this. Nothing is stopping you. You are in the zone. You're learning and you're loving it. Now, imagine you are doing exactly the same thing, But now the professor is standing in the middle of a crowded park. Dogs are barking, music is blaring, there are fireworks going off, and you can't focus. You can't hear. You don't even know what to write down, so you begin to shut down and say, forget it. I have no idea what he's saying. I'm not getting any of this. So this is a very loose description of what your child may be feeling when you leave the felt safety of your home for an event, whether it is something fun, like a birthday party, excitatory stress, or something negative like therapy. Not all therapy, but you know what I mean. Dentist, doctor, those kinds of things that might be a negative stress for them. So when you take your child out of the felt safe environment to the unknown, behaviors escalate, and the child can't regulate. So no new habits or skills can be learned in this state. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn, survival mode. But, however, it's extremely important, if you do have a good foundation of connection and some coping mechanisms in place, you can co-regulate more for your child. You can say, I think this party is a little loud. Could we go outside for a minute? Or I see that you're struggling at this practice. Let's see if we can, take a break. Or are you having fun? And maybe they can't answer. Maybe the child is so overwhelmed that they're like, I don't know. Then it's time to step back and be the brain for your child and say, let's step back from this. And I say, when you're in this situation, when there's a major regression, because you're constantly busy and constantly going out of the house, it's time to scrape some things off your plate for the betterment of your child and your family and more peace in the home. Now, the third level of the trauma bucket is life change. We all have life changes. Everybody has them. Major changes in schedule, like going back to school. Novel situations like joining a new class. And your kiddo wants to take karate, so you sign them up, and it's new and it's scary. Or you have to move across the country and you leave friends and family behind. Behaviors escalate, whatever that change is. When we are stressed, we regress. And often I find we expect more out of our children than we do ourselves. We just think they're just going to understand, and they don't. So it feels as if nothing is working. You see a lot of regression. You may feel like you're at the beginning in a game of Monopoly. Don't collect $200, the rewards of all your hard work that you've put in, and go back to the starting point. It's not really true. It just feels that way. For instance, if you're moving and all of a sudden your child is triggered and you're triggered, and it feels like you're starting back at ground zero and you're not really sure what's going on, just remember, there are cycles in everyone's lives. And when new things and changes happen, there's going to be regression. And that feeling like, oh my gosh, I can't parent anymore. You still can parent. You still have the tools in your tool belt. All of the ones that you were using before still work. So slow down. Keep the mindset. I do have the tools. I'm going to pivot a little bit here. Meltdowns might be a little more frequent and maybe a little more severe like they were in the beginning, but I know what to do. And I'm going to start doing that. Go back to the basics. And you keep trying those different parenting tools until you find what that's going to work for today. Just remember, this isn't going to last forever. The trauma bucket's going to go back down to level 1. It's going to go back to level 2 on some days when you're busy. So just remember that you can do this. It's just a season. All right? And then level 4, which I don't even like to talk about, but it's there. This is when the bucket overflows. This is violence. You know, a lot of times when kids have had a lot of trauma when they were younger, when they hit those teenage years, they're angry, they're depressed, they can become suicidal, they have complete shutdown. At this level, what I say to you is they need professional help. Don't try to do this alone. You don't need to handle it alone. Believe me, speaking from personal experience, a lot of these things I kept silent about, and I tried to handle them alone, and it was the wrong thing to do. So just to recap, we all have a trauma bucket. I want to leave on a positive note. And if you know what kinds of trauma that your kiddos have in their bucket, when they come home to you through adoption, or you know that they had a lot of trauma in when they were born, it was a difficult pregnancy, a difficult birth, or they were in the NICU, or all three of those, then you've got 3. And then if they come home to you through adoption and they have neglect, which says you don't exist, or abuse, which teaches the belief you don't matter, or they had a big T trauma, like they lived through a house fire or a car accident, or those little T traumas, those little paper cuts where it was just a constant thing in their home. So so you know those things. You know that those are already in their bucket, and they react to stressors differently. Then we can, at that level, begin to teach them some coping mechanisms, find some parenting tools that work, like the instead of tips that I have. Instead of traditional parenting, use these instead of tips, and they work really well with neurodivergent children. And then you get to level 2 is when you're taking the child outside the home. You're going to have to regulate more. Level 3, when you have a major change in your life, there can be regression. Level 4, when you have depression, suicide, violence, suicidal tendencies, get help. So that's all for today. Thanks for joining me.